Hi, it is your buddy Peace and Harmony with you here today. We're zooming in and focusing in on a great viewer experience question and comment that we got in, and that was in a very severe relationship difficulty and dynamic with a female malignant narcissist, a psychopath type of individual, an individual who presented with a very impaired moral judgment. And when we look at antisocial behavior, when we look at a malignant narcissist, or really more of a sociopathic or psychopathic individual, there is actually neurological basis for this impaired moral judgment, which you will see then presented in the relationship, which oftentimes creates an enormous amount of emotional difficulty, emotional dysregulation, emotional manipulation of others who really they are closest to. And furthermore, when you understand the physiological basis for this, it'll help you to feel and realize that there is nothing that you could have done to prevent it. There is nothing that you could have done personally that was your shortcoming, that was your falling out, anything that you could have done to prevent it, because based on the neurological functioning of several neurological centers in the brain that are associated with risk, fear, judgment, as well as morality and emotional regulation, there is an impairment in these processing areas of the brain, which result in severe emotional and impaired moral judgment. Particularly when it comes to, being very antisocial. In other words, breaking social norms such as loyalty to a spouse, loyalty to a family, loyalty to a job. Proper decision making, that most people would have an emotional mechanism which would help them to be, provide the foundation for proper decision making. In other words, to make a choice based on best outcome for not only the individual but for the other, or really the group at large. But we see a real impaired moral judgment function disorder, really, especially in the anatomy of the psychopath, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This is a part of the brain which is involved in a number of important areas, including morality, judgment, risk, and fear. And so when you have a dysregulation, it's very important to understand its outcome and how it presents. And I want to go into a little bit of information on this, because it's very interesting that really a large amount of this individual's normal intellectual capacity is remaining intact. So it's not that they're suffering something, a disability, in sort of, an intellectual disability, a cognitive disability, or what you might consider like retardation or autism or something like this. Oftentimes, most of the other intellectual capacity is preserved. But where you really see the difference is in the emotional choice of outcomes, whether they lead to a positive for the self, a positive for the other, and then how the emotions are then as a foundation for that decision-making process. And subjects, there's been quite a bit of studies that I'm going to cite here that look at the issues or disorder in the processing of regulation of emotion in these areas. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, it plays an important role in regulating and inhibiting responses to emotions, and especially our emotional reactions to certain social outcomes. And it allows sort of a disorder of physiology and emotions when it relates to making choices, especially when it comes to morality and judgment, and furthermore learning. We find that people who have disorders in this area of the brain have a real tendency to not be able to learn from mistakes, especially when negative consequences were previously experienced. These people tend to make the same decisions again and again and again, and don't learn from their behavior. So, for example, the fact that they might be disloyal to their family, their work, their children, certain relationship obligations, and they get a negative consequence. They might get, a lot of yelling. They might get, a delay in love from their family members. There is not a loyalty there. So, you see that the children are upset because the father has not, presented on time, or is not affection in proper ways. And despite the yelling, despite the consequences, despite, that this is wrong, this person tends to repeat the same poor choices again and again and again, even if it's on severe levels, even though one's emotions would normally stop one and correct them and provide that automatic, circuit. In this area, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, there's a disorder of processing and alerting other areas of the brain, which would create the learning, which would create the emotional responses, which would help them to learn and make better choices. That whole circuitry is not functioning normally. So we see this antisocial behavior. And it's very, it's also associated with anger and violence. And, it really is part of the neurological basis for what you might see presented in your relationship with this individual, which you see kind of going off the rails, making very rash, poor decisions, poor judgment, high-risk behaviors that seem out of the ordinary and oftentimes seem to be personally directed, or you might be personally witness to or in a close relationship with them, and they keep cheating, they keep violating certain relationship protocol, things that would be normal common sense, yet this person is making poor decisions in their workplace, doing things that most people wouldn't do, in their family, doing things most people would not do. They'd have an automatic emotional break in the system. They don't have that same emotional regulation. So it's as if, there's no really sort of emotional brakes on the car, if you will. So you can't take it personally. You can't think that you're not pretty enough, smart enough, handsome enough, rich enough, fun enough, attentive enough. A lot of the people who tend to be in relationships with them tend to self-blame, be very self-critical, and feel as a victim from this, and then pull the blame according to themselves. What was it that I did wrong? I want you to release that guilt, release that self-doubt, release that self-condemnation, which is, beating yourself up. And furthermore, just let it go, because there is a definite physiological basis to this improper moral judgment that you see, and oftentimes this very antisocial behavior, which you may have been witness to or involved in personally. It is your buddy Peace and Harmony with you here today, and I hope that these videos do help. Please share and please subscribe for more great tools, videos, discussion, and support.